Hey, Nicole. Yeah.
Welcome everyone. Welcome and thank you for your patience. We're starting a few minutes late. We were having a few technical issues, but we want to get rolling this morning. Thank you for connecting on time, and we want to give you a warm welcome to the COP. As you can see on the presentation here, the title of this COP is Self-Harm and the Role of Peer Support. This is prepared for today, and we just want to go through a few housekeeping items before we begin with the material. First of all, if you can't hear us, please go to your Zoom settings and you can choose a different microphone or speaker and try different ones in order to hear the presentation. But a few reminders. As you can notice, this session is being recorded. To protect your privacy, if you wish to remain anonymous, please feel free to turn off your video. If not, please turn it on. We love to see your smiling faces. You're welcome to keep your video on for the entire presentation. Please do not share any personal information in the chat for the same privacy reasons. And please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking or you want to participate. We encourage you to participate later in the session. And that's why we have the Zoom engagement tools. These without your microphone, you can use in order to react or participate and make this presentation as interactive as possible. If you experience any issues with audio video, please drop a message in the chat. We're going to try to help you. We appreciate your involvement and interaction as we let some more people in. Also, another reminder regarding certificates and evaluations. In order to receive your certificates and CEUs, you must leave your name in the evaluation and stay for the entire COP presentation today. We will also be saving the attendance from Zoom. Now, moving on with our presentation, we want to review the objectives for today. As you can see on the presentation here, today we want to define self-harm, identifying signs of potential self-harm, and the intersection of mental health and substance use disorder, recognizing issues related to self-harm and relationships to substance use disorder, understanding the role of the peer support coach in supporting a person who is displaying self-harm. As we have those clear, we want to introduce our facilitator today, Carol Furlong, who was retired from the Elliott Health System in December of 2023 after a distinguished career in the New Hampshire healthcare system, advancing the treatment of substance use disorder. She continues to consult for a number of organizations and associations to share her expertise and to continue to promote compassionate patient-centered care. We are going to enjoy to hear her insights today. So I'm pleased to hand it off to Carol, who will introduce today's subject.
Thanks, Danny. You can go ahead and go to the first page. So we're going to talk about non-suicidal self-injury, otherwise known as self-harm. And I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. So don't be confused if I say self-harm instead of NSSI, which is how non-suicidal self-injury is also identified. Go ahead. What is it? It's an intentional harm to one's own body without suicidal intent. So people who self-harm are not intending to die. They don't have that level of intent or a plan to die. Instead, they are harming themselves in some ways, such as cutting, burning, scratching, banging, hitting. And just to let some of you know, more common and more recent research also indicates that excessive, I'm going to say that in quotes, tattooing is also potentially considered self-harm. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not suggesting that anybody who tattoos is a self-harmer. And you have to look at what their intent is. If they're appreciating the art of it, that's not self-harm. But some individuals have now been found to want the pain of the tattoo as a distraction. And the art of it is kind of secondary to it. So just keep that in mind. I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that people who tattoo are self-harming. And most people who self-injure have used multiple methods of self-injury. Sometimes because the damage that they have done in their first way of self-harm has become so significant that they can't hide it, or they're worried about the impact. So, for example, they have cut themselves so frequently and perhaps to the point where they actually worried about how deep they had cut, that rather than take that risk, they turn to burning or hitting, for example. Okay, next one. Okay. Who typically engages in self-harm? It's most common among adolescents and young adults. I have seen people in their early 30s to early 40s. That's much more rare, and usually it dissipates after that. It makes sense. The typical onset is around age 13 or 14, and the lifetime rates in those populations are about 50 to 20%. That's pretty significant. It makes sense that it's that age range in particular because they haven't fully developed coping skills to deal with those negative emotions. That's a part of it. And we're also going to talk throughout this probably about the cultural aspects of it. But we'll get to that. Rates of self-harm typically are higher amongst those experiencing mental health symptoms, and rates of men versus women tend to be equal. And that's pretty interesting because when people think about self-harm, when people in the profession think about self-harm, we tend to think about women much more than men. Self-harm, self-mutilating, non-suicidal self-injury in the past has typically been associated with individuals who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And the majority of people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder have been women. And so we tend to associate self-injury with women, but not necessarily true. Specifically, women are more likely to use cutting versus men who are more likely to use hitting or burning. Cutting, burning can both be hidden fairly well if you wear long sleeves, but in the summertime in particular, it's more likely. So one of the things you should look at if you're concerned or have a hint of that someone may be self-harming is, are they wearing long sleeves in the summer? Now with the hot weather, if someone's wearing long sleeves, I want to start asking why, or at least questioning, aren't they hot? And trying to find that out. But hitting is pretty easily hidden because you can say, oh, you know, I'm accident prone. I just bump into things. I hit myself accidentally. I fall, whatever. And it's easier to hide. And so we typically don't ask men the same kind of questions, or as often do we ask them as women. Okay. Why do people self-injure? It's the most commonly function to temporarily alleviate overwhelming negative emotion. They can't handle or feel that they can't handle whatever that emotion is, anxiety, depression. They need something to replace it, something to distract from it. We also, one of the things I was going to say before, and I said we talk about it throughout this, is our cultural belief. I just did a presentation on sleep disorders to primary care physicians. And one of the things I
want to webinar is self-harm when it comes to peer recovery work.
One of the things I wanted to point out to them was that they too easily prescribe anti-anxiety meds for sleep. Part of that reason, again, is because of our cultural belief that if you're uncomfortable, take something for it. And in the substance use population, that has also been a cultural belief that if you are experiencing pleasant, unpleasant emotions, reactions, there should be something to take for it. And primary care physicians unknowingly are cooperating with that cultural belief. So if I'm experiencing some anxiety, some depression, and it's starting to overwhelm me, or I can't handle it right now, then I want to take something for it. And if I can't take something for it, I want to do something to alleviate it. And the pain from the self-harm replaces that negative emotion. Instead of being anxious about the test tomorrow or the job interview tomorrow, I'm going to cut myself and I will focus on that pain now, very temporarily, certainly not going to last. I can focus on not just the pain, but the remedy for it and taking care of that rather than worrying about that other distraction. So slightly more than one half of people report that they self-injure as a form of self-directed anger or self-punishment. So this is a little bit different. Now they're not just alleviating the pain. Now they're punishing themselves. I should have studied more for that test. I really blew that interview. Or I can't believe I used again. I can't believe, why did I drink again? I'm a bad person. I failed. And so they injure themselves as a way to punish themselves. Again, they want to not focus on what they perceive as their failure, as their weakness. They want to be able to focus on the pain. It's a distraction. Self-harm can also serve multiple other functions, such as a desire to influence others or to produce a physical sign of emotional abuse. Now, again, when we thought this was primarily a function of borderline personality disorder, we used to kind of negatively attribute it to attention seeking. Oh, they're just looking for attention. That was our attitude as people in the helping profession, believe it or not. When in reality, they are seeking attention, but it's because they want people to know they are in distress, that something is bothering them. Now, isn't it interesting that they will do that, but then they'll cover it up? They want someone to know, but they're embarrassed or ashamed or frightened about what you'll do if you find out. So you have to be careful with this. You want to be able to address it because you want to help them develop coping mechanisms, but you can't pay too much attention. You can't just focus on the injury because you might encourage that behavior more. If I can get your attention, if I can spend more time with you by calling your attention to this, and then you spend the session just focusing on the injury and not potential remedies or not why I did it, then that's in some ways comforting to me. I have your undivided attention and I know you want to help. I'm developing a relationship with you. I think that has to be particularly difficult for people who work in peer support, because one of your goals is to develop a great peer relationship, peer support relationship with them, but you can't become their friend. And that's the worry that you might have, because the more you talk about it, the more supportive you are. They do see you as a friend. So you have to walk that fine line. Boundaries are most important for you guys. And you want to make sure that they don't take advantage of that. Not in a mean, directed, manipulative way, but naturally they want to do that. There can be a way, and again, when we associated this with borderline personality, we used to attribute this to a manipulation, that they wanted your attention in a negative, non-helpful, inappropriate way. I think you really have to see it instead as a cry for help. If they are letting you know that they are doing it, that is a sign of their trust for you. And you need to be able to address it. And we're going to talk more about how to address it helpfully. Okay. I think, was there maybe one more? No. Okay, so What's the difference between self-harm and suicidal behavior? Non-suicidal self-injury is much more prevalent than suicidal behaviors. It involves different methods such as cutting and burning. Obviously, though, people who commit suicide do use cutting as a way to successfully complete suicide. They just know how deep to cut. It's typically a non-lethal means, and again, they don't intend to end their life, and they're not experiencing suicidal ideation. The caution here is sometimes accidents happen. They may intend to just cut, but they cut too deep. They may intend to harm themselves, but it results in more serious action. So you still have to take, although we see these behaviors as typically non-lethal, you have to keep in the back of your mind that they could become lethal and be cautious about them because of that. Suicidal behaviors, on the other hand, typically involve more lethal means, including hanging or firearms. Those are typically male ways to successfully complete suicide, as opposed to females who typically will overdose on pills. People with suicidal ideation have very concrete plans and intents. Those are the questions you need to ask. Do you want to die? Did you intend to die? Do you intend to die? And do you have a plan? And if they give you a very specific plan, that is not self-harm. That is suicidal behavior. Different outcome, different next steps. And we'll talk about that briefly. They're certainly more hopeless. They don't see any other options, as opposed to people who self-harm, who don't intend to die. This is a temporary distraction. They are somewhat hopeless in that they don't know what else to do. They don't know other coping skills. And that's our job, to help them develop those coping skills. And people with suicidal ideation want to end their life. Okay. Self-harm causes increased risks due to the association with emotional and interpersonal distress. It increases the risk for suicidal ideation and a desire, because if I'm using this technique to temporarily alleviate my pain, my negative emotion, and it doesn't work, my options are becoming limited. So it can develop into suicidal thoughts. It certainly can desensitize people to the pain associated with self-injurious behaviors, which increases the capability to act on suicidal desire. If I have had some temporary suicidal thoughts, don't have a plan, don't have an intent necessarily, but I start to think about how I would do it in the beginning, and I've never engaged in self-harm before, sometimes, and I think about, well, I could slice my wrist open. But sometimes what stops people is the idea of doing that. That's going to hurt. What if I make a mistake? What if I do it wrong? But if they've been engaging in self-harm, they're becoming quite proficient at this. They know how deep they can cut. They know how they can cut. And I won't go into that now, but there is one way that's more effective than another. And they know that. It takes away the fears that might have normally stopped them from committing that act. It presents double trouble in that it increases for both the suicidal ideation. I'm more hopeless now because all of these things I've been trying have not been working. I've even been willing to hurt myself, and I have failed at that, becoming more hopeless. And it increases their ability to act on it, because now I have some experience with this. Okay, next one. Non-suicidal self-injury, self-harm has been shown to exhibit many similarities to substance use disorders. Populations who self-injure may resemble populations with substance use disorders in personality or impulsivity traits. Now, again, we know that most of the population who have substance use issues have an accompanying mental health issue, comorbid. A great majority have some. So those are shared traits. It could be as much as 60% of the population that engages in self-harm meets the criteria for a substance use disorder. Now, that's an interesting statistic. And I'd love to see some studies. I haven't yet, but I'd love to see more studies that talk about that a little bit more in depth, because I wonder if they're seeing people who use a substance as indicating that they're self-harming. Many people who use substances don't do it to self-harm. Some do. I don't think it's 60%. So I think we need more research on this. But I know people early in recovery sometimes do think they have failed if they relapse, if they slip. And they may engage in self-harm in that way. And I think that the studies probably indicate that if you've slipped or relapsed and you say, what the hell, I might as well use again, I'm not sure that doesn't qualify as self-harm because they know what they're doing. It's often utilized to manage negative emotions that they're struggling with. And again, that presentation I just did on sleep disorders, that's one of the things I kept talking about with the primary care providers. You have to be aware that people manage emotions with substances or alternative negative behaviors. Those are their coping skills. We can't even say it's dysfunctional coping skills because they function. They complete what they are looking for. Their function is to alleviate or replace those negative emotions. That's functional. Not healthy, it's not appropriate, but it's working for them. And so then they go to the doctor and they say, give me a medication. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about Suboxone or any medication-assisted treatment. I'm not talking about that. I'm mostly talking about treatment for anxiety disorders. And I think it's critically important that we give people skills to address that, because these are some of the behaviors that they attempt when they're not having their anxiety relieved. Some early research indicates that self-harm as an addiction and has similar addictive qualities as substance use. When you've tried something and it works, and cutting alleviates that negative anxiety, you do in some ways become addicted to it. I know it's going to work. That's what I need. That's what numbs my pain. I have physical pain, but I don't have emotional pain. And I'd rather have the physical pain. So there's a lot of similarities. Next. Crisis versus self-harm. They're not the same thing. If the first time you are presented with someone who is self-harming, you may feel it's a crisis, but you can't react that way. It's kind of contradictory to what we want to do. When a client is experiencing a crisis, they will need to be guided to help immediately. So if a client is reporting an immediate plan or an intent to act, they need to seek treatment from an emergency department. Let me just say this. If you are working with someone who says, I have a plan, and he or she details that to you, and they intend to do it, I've had people say, yep, next Saturday, everyone's going to be gone from the house. I'm going to go out to the garage, and I'm going to start the car and kill myself that way. And I'll be dead by the time they return. That's a pretty specific plan. You're not going to wait till Saturday to get them into the hospital. But here's the concern. Do not drive them to the hospital yourself. Do not walk them to the hospital yourself. because you don't know what can happen on the way. And you don't want to feel responsible if there's something negative that happens. Call an ambulance. Get an ambulance to come. Now that sometimes takes some persuading. And you may worry, and they may say to you, if I thought you were going to do this, I would never have called you. Okay. But our responsibility is to keep them safe. And I don't usually make it about me, but if I'm trying to persuade someone to go to the emergency room, I'm not above saying, you know what, I understand completely, and you probably do feel betrayed by me. But I need to leave the office today knowing that I did the best I could for you and that you're going to be safe. It is about me at that point. Now, what is the point of that? Why would I do that? It's important that they be safe. But the other part is this. People who want to harm themselves do not want to harm others. So they don't want to think that there may be some harm to me. I don't go into my emotional well-being. I just say, I want to be sure that you're safe. That's all. During periods of self-harm, a client may be reporting emotional distress, which they're looking for a relief from. This is not a crisis. There's no safety concerns, and they're not presenting at risk of suicidal ideation. Now, you may wonder, wait a minute, they're cutting themselves, they're burning themselves. There's no safety concerns? When we say safety concerns, they're not suicidal. They don't have a plan, they don't have an intent. And in many cases, they know exactly where they can cut, how deep they can cut. They know what to use. There's not going to be any, I'm going to say serious, all these are serious, but there's no lethal objective here. So that's different from suicidal intent. Self-harm is not suicidal attempts. You have to make that distinction because they want you to make that distinction too. This is a good time. This is your opportunity to reinforce skills that they may already have that are helpful to them. Part of your job is helping them become aware of the fact that they do have these skills. When you are panicking, when you are worrying about something, when you're anxious, when you're depressed, you're not thinking about what else can I do. You're focused right at that moment. You forget that you've had these other skills. So that's our job, to get to know what those are. Okay. The role of the peer support worker. Okay, so first of all, let me say good luck. You have a hard job with this in particular. What can you do? Use shared language. That's what you do anyways. Use language that you find in peer recovery that can be helpful in talking about non-suicidal self-injury. Shared language can validate the experience. But don't talk about your shared experiences with self-harm. Because if you do that, if you talk about, yep, I used to do the same thing, this is what I used to do, you've now normalized that behavior. And you've given them a reason to say, well, you're okay, why should I stop? You're going to get into a whole other territory of rationalizing why you did it and they can't, or why you don't want them to. That's not the focus of this. So use the shared language that you would normally use, but be careful of the experiences that you share. Assess the situation. What does your client need in that moment? Sometimes he or she or they just need you to listen because it was difficult to bring this up. It was difficult to share this with you. They need to see that you are not shocked, accusatory, that you can just deal with this situation. Don't panic. Remaining calm will allow your client to feel supported in their recovery journey. Now, I would ask, for those of you who have experienced this, working with a client who self-injures, or if you think about dealing with a client who self-injures, think about that situation. Someone has just shown you that they have a series of pretty bad cuts on their arms and on their stomach, because those are the most frequent places, sometimes legs, but they usually start with their arms and then go to their stomach. Same with burns. And they show you that for the first time. I can tell you my first time, I could feel my heart pumping because I've got an awesome responsibility here. And I got nervous. And it's important that I say the right thing. That's okay. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But just accept that this is a kind of a nerve-wracking situation. Don't emotionally accept responsibility for their distress. I had a friend of mine recently who was talking about, he works with disabled veterans and he doesn't sleep at night, worrying about whether they're going to harm themselves. And he asked, haven't you worried about your clients? And my answer, and I think he was a little taken aback by this, my answer was no. I work with them. I know I've done the best I can at any given moment. But their actions are their actions, their choices. I can't feel responsible for it. All I can do is make sure I can help them be as safe as possible. Then I've done my job, and it's the same for you. Don't promise secrecy. That's a killer. They may tell you, I'll tell you, but don't tell anyone else. This will have negative consequences. If anyone else finds out this is going to happen or that's going to happen, you can't promise secrecy. First of all, you have a responsibility to document this for their sake, for your sake, for the organization's sake that you work for. Secondly, if during that discussion, they tell you that they do have suicidal intent and they do have a plan, confidentiality is out the window. You have to act immediately and begin that process of getting them into the hospital. Now, if you promise you're going to keep this secret, within minutes, you've broken that promise. That's going to have a setback to your relationship. It may anyways, by the fact that you are encouraging them to go to the hospital. Don't add secrecy, broken promises of secrecy to that. Okay. Before we go to questions, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. One, how do you react? So you're going to listen and you're going to validate. Be careful of saying, I know how you feel. You don't. You're not in. My old professor used to say, we're all bags of skin that have different experiences and different emotions and different cultural impacts. You're not in their bag of skin. Even if there have been incredible similarities in your lives, it's still different. You have a different physical identity, you have different cultural backgrounds, maybe you have different substances you've used, different mental health issues. You're not identical to them, so you can't fully understand. You can understand what they've told you. You can understand what they say they have felt, how they have felt, but you don't understand how they feel. So be careful with that. Ask open-ended questions. So you say you cut. Can you tell me how you feel before you cut? What's that like? How does it feel physically? Does your heart pound? Do you get really nervous? Do you tense up? What are your thoughts? And let them tell you about that. They're setting the background for an understanding of what occurs so that you can then ask, how does this help to make you feel better? When you cut, what does that do to you? You said before you cut, your chest is pounding, you're really nervous, you got a headache. Then you cut, and do those things go away? Your goal is to get as firm of an understanding to this as you can. What else have you tried? So have you tried everything else? Again, you have those physical symptoms, you're worrying, nothing's going to work, I'm a failure, chest pounding. Have you tried anything else? And it's okay if they say, no, I've never done that. That's actually great because you have a wide array of things now that you can offer and talk to them about. If they say, I've tried everything, okay, tell me what those things are. You're trying to come up with things they have tried that have maybe been partially successful, so you can kind of play with those a little bit to make them more successful, or looking at options that they may not have thought of. Listen attentively. So we talked about how this can be heart-pounding for us dealing with this. So look at how you are listening. Obviously, you want to pay close attention to what they're saying, but there's a difference between me sitting and listening very calmly and me sitting forward. Sometimes that can express interest, but most of the time that can be perceived as aggressive. Tell me, I want you to tell me now. They have to be eased into it sometimes. They have to feel comfortable with you. Make good eye contact. Don't stare them down. Make appropriate eye contact, but make sure you do that because they're going to interpret, if you don't make eye contact with them, that you are embarrassed, you're ashamed of them, and they've done something wrong. That's not the message you want to give. You have to be singular focus. Your goal is to understand why they've done it, what are the precursors of it, and what they tried, so that you can begin to think about, all right, what are some things that we can talk about? You want to find those new coping mechanisms. Refrain from any negative responses. The reason they are reluctant to talk about this is because they've had too many people say, what? Why are you doing that? Don't do that. Don't say that. Again, listen. You just want to listen. Help look for alternatives. Okay, so now that you've explained to me kind of what happens before and what you've done and how this works, I understand how cutting helps you deal with this. But are you open to thinking about other things that have worked? Can maybe we brainstorm about trying some other things? Don't discourage their behavior until you identify appropriate coping strategies. So even when you come up with other alternatives, don't say, okay, so until the next time I see you, don't cut anymore. You're going to try these things. That's a failure for them because they're going to. They're going to try it sporadically. They have to see if it's going to succeed. But in the meantime, the one successful behavior that they have, we don't like to think of it that way, but if it's alleviating their anxiety, it's successful for them. Don't take that away from them. So again, don't say, just stop doing that. Try these other things instead. Avoid giving examples from your life. As I said, you don't want to talk about any self-harm that you have engaged in the past, because it shifts the focus away from them and onto you. And for some people who feel responsible and worry about a lot of things, the last thing you want is for them to start worrying about you. Oh, I can't say anything to her or to him, because then she's going to worry. She's going to be more anxious and she'll go back to cutting. I'm not going to be I don't want to be responsible for that. It's got to be about them. And then once you've had all of those discussions, are they willing to talk to a professional about this? And if they're not, okay, for now. I wouldn't say to them, okay, for now, but in my mind, I'm thinking, all right, we're gonna work on this, but my goal is to help you see a professional. And the way that's gonna work is your relationship. We know that the one most beneficial thing in any clinical setting, any clinical procedure, it's not the technique you use, it's the relationship. And if you're open and listening and observing and accepting, as hard as that may be, then they're going to start thinking, all right, if they're like that, maybe they'll send me to someone, or they work with someone who is like them. Maybe they can help present this to that professional, and they're more likely to do it. You're an entryway. As you know, you're an entryway to others. So keep all of that in mind. And now, do we have questions?
Okay, this is Lindy Keller. I'm going to try to help facilitate this here. And so if you have any questions, you can either, because there's a lot of people here, so either raise your virtual hand there with the icons at the bottom, or write something in the chat. And I'm going to monitor both of those, and I'll call on people, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. I know she did a good presentation, but you must have some questions. Erica.
Hi, Carol. Thank you for your presentation. I think you did a wonderful job. I learned a lot, some new things. And I guess this might be a silly question, but you did a great job explaining like what to do when you see the signs, right? But sometimes there's no signs. And so like, I guess I just had a recent experience where I had a participant who was successful at committing suicide, and like racking my brain and like thinking, what did I miss? And so I guess, yeah, I mean, what, like those are, when people are giving you signs, I feel like that's great in a way, right? That's good. This was a newer participant. We only had 3 meetings together. And so, yeah, I guess we built some rapport, obviously. So what are your tips or tricks or feedback for that?
So the first thing I would say is, I don't know you well, but I wasn't aware that you were Superwoman and that you would immediately see all these signs. They're very good. Patients are very good about not giving you signs, particularly if they're really intent on doing it. They don't want you to stop them. So it may not have been, I'm sure it wasn't that you missed any signs. It's not a glow. I mean, it sounds like I'm being facetious. I'm really not. There's no outward signs unless they give them to you. What I think you probably learn from that is, don't be afraid to ask. Anytime, right? The worst thing that can happen is you're going to ask them and they're going to say, no, why would you ask me that? Okay. Just checking. What that does is give them the message that anything is open to talk about. You don't apologize for asking the question, because you may ask them again. But as you also said, you had 3 sessions with them. They were good at hiding it. You know, I talked about my friend who asked me if I feel responsible, and I don't feel responsible, but I've lost 2 people in 42 years. I've lost 2 people. I remember their names. I remember their faces. I remember the details about it. I know there was nothing I could do to stop it. And it also involved substance use. One was an overdose. He had just gotten out of recovery, had no tolerance, and went to a party, which I did everything to dissuade him from. He knew there were going to be drugs there. And he was found the next day dead in his car. And when they interviewed the other people from the party, amazingly enough, they said, we don't understand it. He didn't use nearly what he used before. He didn't realize the impact. No matter how much I talked to him about it, he knew better. He didn't intend to die. And the other one was someone who had been depressed and was doing much better after several months, had gotten back with his wife, had restored his work, his leisure life, his family life, and he decided to treat himself to go fishing. But he brought some alcohol with him, a lot of alcohol, come to find out. And he became increasingly depressed while he was fishing and killed himself. There's nothing to predict there. So maybe you've missed the signs because they didn't tell you, they hid them from you. And maybe there were no signs. Maybe this was sudden, you don't know. But the only way that you can feel assured by it is ask. Just ask. No harm in that. Just say, I routinely ask, have you ever thought about suicide? And then you've done it. You've done your job. Does that help?
Thanks. It does. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. Tanya, you have a question?
I just wanted to say that, like Erica, I lost somebody this week to suicide. It was a participant that was semi-new to me. He lived in a sober living house, and I had spoken to him the day before. He said he was good. He paid up his rent. So it's very hard to know, because a lot of times people that are intentional don't reach out and don't say anything, and they'll tie up all their loose ends and put on a happy face. And nobody in the sober living house knew that he was upset, and it was his girlfriend that ended up calling 911 and sending the officers to the house because she couldn't reach him. It's very upsetting. This presentation today was kind of, hard for me, but thank you very much for it. I appreciate it.
Sorry for your loss. I know
Thank
how.
you. Are there other questions? Other questions about self-harm, differences between that and suicidal ideation? Or any other comments? Kelly, do you want to unmute? Thank you.
Yes, I have a quick question. I attended another SAMHSA webinar on suicide, and I wonder if you could speak to the language that we're using now to talk about it. I noticed that you used the term successfully completed suicide, and in this training that I went to, they mentioned that we were moving away from that type of language, and I wonder if you can speak to that. As we're working with clients and participants, they were saying that the word successful needs to sort of be not so much wiped, but they're moving away from using that language. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure.
Carol?
Yep, I totally agree with them. You'll notice that I also slipped sometimes and said committed, which is a no-no.
Yep.
So yes, completed is much more appropriate, and I apologize for that. I think that it's sometimes hard. This sounds like an excuse, and I guess it probably is. It's hard to keep up with the more appropriate phrases, and that's important for us to do. We went from committed suicide to completed suicide because committed is a word that usually indicates a transgression of some kind. So we commit sins, we commit crimes. This is neither. It's suicide. So they completed suicide. And I suppose if it was an unsuccessful, it would be attempted suicide. So you're right. It shouldn't be successful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And they did mention that even using completed they're moving it out of their language and in print to just say the statement died by suicide. So I guess it's even going further, and it's confusing because when you were having these conversations, like referencing, like what is the appropriate reference? And yes, understanding that we're in an age of pronouns and language, and where that is really important to people, trying to understand where that is going would be helpful as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to keep up with it, definitely. And I'm going to say try to be as appropriate as possible. But again, when you're talking to a client, you're just going to ask very direct questions, right? You're not going to act, you're probably not going to say, did you complete suicide? Did you, whatever. You're going to ask, have you ever tried? How have you tried? What did you do? You're going to ask them much more specific questions. And I kind of hate to say this, but when you're with a client, this is so politically incorrect. I apologize up front, but don't get bogged down by, did I use the right word? Because you're not going to be using those things with a client. You want to be as upfront and factual with a client, as down to earth as you can be. Because the last thing you want is to give them a sense that you're worried about it, embarrassed about it, unsure of your words. Have you tried to harm yourself? Is different from, have you tried to commit, complete? Have you ever tried to die? Whatever it is, they want to be able to talk to you frankly about it. Not saying don't be appropriate. I'm saying be mindful of the client.
Yes, thank you for that.
Thanks, Kelly. Anybody else? We still have a little bit of time left. Billy, jump right in.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I mean, I find myself probably in a lot of trouble with my peers in regards to this concept, because I have a much more raw and human approach, less robotic and less, wordy and all that stuff. And it's very it doesn't sit well with my peers in the field. However, when I'm speaking with a participant, a client, somebody who, or there we go with language again, but when I speak with a human being that sits with me to have a conversation, I'm just giving them a real raw representation of who and what I am and how to meet their needs, and and most often it's very simple communication and connection building. It's not wordy. I'm not trying to get them from point A to point Z. I'm literally just trying to build a rapport with them. And then throughout that process, for me, in my experience, it creates this space where I can help them because they're willing to listen. So I agree with this, and I understand the wording, and I get the standpoint on a lot of my peers in the field. However, in my experience, I connect with a lot of people very quickly from this very non-robotic, non-educated, just very human, in the trench level, and it seems to have an absolute incredible building process. So I don't know. I just wanted to kind of, anyone who might be new to this field or might be a little unnerving about how to be appropriate, how to not be appropriate. There's going to be naysayers in this process throughout the whole thing. However, I believe the most important person is the one who is coming to look for guidance versus the other people in the field that seem to think that my approach is unorthodox. So I would encourage the individual who is maybe questioning their vocabulary to just kind of just be a human being, and that will get you so far with your people. So that's what I got.
Thanks, Billy.
Can I just comment on that?
Absolutely, Carol.
I think, Billy, that I agree with just about everything you said. In order to be a good therapist, peer support person, whatever it is, we have to be real, right? It's our relationship with the clients that makes the difference. And if we are that pseudo professional, that pseudo helper who projects ourselves as up here and the clients down here, that's a problem. We are all peers, and that we are all human beings. And you use that phrase, and I think it's really important. We relate to one another as human beings. I would just caution you, though. I hear what you're saying when you say you're raw. I feel, I would use a different word. I'm real. I think you're saying you're real in these relationships, but just remember, this isn't about you. It's about them. So you want to be comfortable, but the first, as you said, the first priority is making them comfortable so that they'll talk to you. And sometimes that's going to mean you temper your language, but overall, it's the relationship. It's always the relationship, right? Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Questions, or some of you, it's not so much a question, it's a comment, and that's been very valuable as well. So feel free to speak up if there's something you want to add to this conversation. Okay, well, seeing none, I think we will hand it off for our breakout groups. Melissa, you want to pick up from there? If you're speaking to us, you're muted.
Sorry about that. No, I was going to ask Carol a quick question about self-harm, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So Carol, there was a time where I had a loved one that was self-harming, and there seemed to have been a cohort of girls doing this exact behavior for several years. And I don't know if you've had any experience with that, with it being sort of looked at as something that a cohort would actually engage in. And I understand that sounds really odd, but having a teenager that did self-harm for a couple of years, it was very much part of the cultural norm, was to self-harm among young girls. Have you ever seen or heard of anything sort of like that? And can you explain, cohorting self-harm?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. That is probably the most common pattern in adolescent girls, that it's a peer activity. It is a way of belonging. It's a way of fitting in, that they can show off their battle scars more than anything else. Yep, this is how much stress I'm under. Look what I did. And again, that almost sounds like attention seeking. In a way it is. They're looking for that camaraderie. They're looking for that shared experience. And as a parent, for example, how do you deal with that? Parental pressure as opposed to peer pressure. Yeah, good luck. Good luck. Because you're in that position where if you're as a parent and you say, don't do that anymore, yeah, it's not going to happen. But you can start talking to them. First of all, you can get them to a therapist. Secondly, as a parent, you can start talking about, what, that does worry me. I understand. Why are you doing it? I mean, not why. You can't say it that way. What happens? The same questions. How do you feel? What is this doing for you? Can I help you find another way to deal with this? Would you like to talk to somebody? Can you talk to me about it? Because I'm worried about the damage that's being done. And sometimes accidents happen. So I understand all your friends are doing this. I wish there was another way that you could deal with it. But it is the most common subpopulation that engages in self-care. Thank you for bringing that up. Probably not as helpful as you'd like it to be.
Okay, well, on that note, I think I'm handing it back over to Growth Partners, who are going to explain the breakout piece that's going to happen next.
Danny, you want to take that?
Sure thing. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms and you're going to have a facilitator. Each facilitator is going to help out, lead the discussion. And we're also going to share with each room the questions that are gonna be the basis of this discussion. So soon you're gonna get an invitation to join the room, or you're gonna be moved there automatically. And after a few minutes, you're gonna be brought back for the debrief. We'll see you in a bit.
Okay, everybody's back, Danny?
Yes,
all right.
everyone is in the main session.
So we have a little bit of time built in here for the various groups to report back on any kind of common things that you identified in your groups. Because I don't know the names of the groups. I'm going to have to, let, I don't know if that's Danny or Melissa, to kind of call out group by group, and then I can help with that. So I think the best thing probably to do would be to, for us to go through the groups. And if you can just give a quick summary, someone from your group, of what kind of experiences people shared with you, just briefly. Yeah.
Great.
Melissa,
Lindy,
do you want to
why don't you start since you were facilitator?
Oh, okay. We had a few people who've had experience with this, and that it was challenging, and there was a sense that you needed to kind of keep calm. One of our folks did have an experience with a person she was working with, and she was very grateful, Carol, that you actually validated. She did exactly the things you said that she should do. And she said it was very early in working, and it was just sort of an instinctual thing. So that was great. It was absolutely wonderful. But we also had some folks who've had some not personal experience with themselves cutting, but not as a peer support, but someone else in their life that they had experienced it. And it was really challenging the first time. And they did learn from that experience to better understand what was behind it.
Great. Thank you, Lindy. All right, Lena, can we have your group report out?
Yes, we had a really great conversation. Some of our main themes of our conversation were talking about the shame involved in self-harm. And one of the most interesting things I found, and I have not thought of, is like seeking connection, but also like meeting a participant in person, like physical, versus like their verbal cues. So we have someone who does like a phone crisis hotline, and so you don't see that physical body language. And then they also just extended their services for chat and text, and so then you're missing the paraverbal and the tone and the inflection. We also talked about the importance of somebody having lived experience, and so like their participant felt less alone, and they can provide support that way. And then we also talked about safety planning and harm reduction, and the difference between suicide ideations and self-harm. And I know that we're having a second breakout group with about resources, so we'll talk more about the lack of resources in that breakout group.
Great. Thank you, Lena. Maggie, would you mind sharing from your group?
Absolutely. We also had a really great discussion. And there was a participant in the group who shared a recent experience with a brand new participant at the RCO that they were able to build a rapport with that person during their very first meeting, and that person self-disclosed about self-harm, and it sounded like it was a very productive conversation, and that participant will be going back to the center I believe next week. So that was really fun good to hear about. That it's very topical.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maggie. Paul, can we hear from your group?
Yeah, so we had a mix of a couple people had experience in the role of a peer support specialist of working with an individual who was self-harming, and then we also had some people who had personal examples outside of that professional role. And we talked about sort of a concern being not inflaming the situation, or when the individual who's self-harming isn't necessarily on board with seeing someone about that, how to not make the situation worse. We had someone who shared that they had an individual in their office who was actually trying to self-harm with various objects on the desk. And we also had some conversation about, we thought it was really interesting when Carol brought up the tattoos. Just anecdotally, it seems like people in recovery communities sometimes do really start to get a lot of tattoos, which was interesting. We sort of ended there right when time was running out.
And then Carol, can we bring you back in and maybe share on anything that was shared from the small groups?
Melissa, I'd like to suggest that we do the same thing around the concerns that people had and then bring Carol in, because I think that's where people would be looking for guidance. Is that okay?
Yeah. Do you have concerns that came out of your group, Lindy?
The biggest one, and I actually, Maggie already brought this up, was concerns about lack of resources for to kind of pass people along to for more in-depth care, was a big one. And then I think the other one is just, and Carol, you had addressed this before, but it is real, is that sense of feeling like I need to make sure that they feel all right when they leave me today, that sense of without the resources, or even with the resources, are they going to follow up with them? And so that kind of, as you said earlier, sort of a sense of responsibility about that. That was the biggest concern that people had.
Great.
Was where does it go from here?
Great. Lena, do you want to come back in and discuss if there were any concerns about supporting somebody with self-harm?
It was mostly like the lack of resources, and I know that we're going to do another breakout group.
Right.
And also too, like we talked about, like that self-disclosure, like, so when you have that lived experience, someone in our group said it was really helpful, and that person didn't feel alone as much anymore. And so I think that's something that I would definitely explore more in our second breakout group, like when that's appropriate, when it's not.
Great, thank you. Maggie, do you want to come back in and talk about any concerns that were brought up from the group that you may not have reported on already?
The primary concerns that we talked about was, having that conversation and not scaring people off, to make sure that they come back and can continue to explore healthy coping mechanisms.
Got it. Thank you so much, Maggie. Okay, Paul, do you mind popping back in and just sharing any concerns that your group had that you may not have been able to report out on?
Yeah, I think similar to what Maggie just shared, really the concerns revolve around if the patient's not receptive to being referred or to talking about it. And I would just pause for a beat and see if anyone that was in my group wants to share anything I might have missed.
Absolutely, we have time for that.
Okay, well, if not, I will jump back in because there was one thing that I forgot, that this didn't have so much as in the peer support role, but our group also had some conversations about younger people, youth, and even fewer resources there, and also the sense of them even being interested in accepting any kind of help if there were resources, and helping them to open up more, to get more and to be willing to share more. So, Carol, I'm going to pass this back to you, and anything that was brought up there in those discussions that you might like to provide some response to.
Sure. I'll leave the lack of resources to the next conversation.
Yep.
But the sense of making sure they're okay, as Billy talked about before, how would you make sure that your best friend is okay? Not that I'm saying a client is your best friend, but you ask. Are you okay with what we've talked about? You want to be able to present that kind of, look at, we're down to earth. We're two people talking here. Don't be afraid to ask, are you okay? And what can we do? Is there anything I can do to help you be more okay before you leave? You are not going to, we talked about not scaring people off. You are not their boss, their parent, your spouse. You're not going to tell them what to do. You're going to listen. Just being non-confrontational and listening is probably going to be a relatively new experience for them. They're going to want to come back. You're not going to solve all their issues in that first session or the early sessions. They're going to have time to make sure you're genuine and real and want to help. Not just tell them what to do, but to be a partner in their recovery. Younger people, again, that's the resources. Self-disclosure, just make sure that the emphasis is still on them. You're not doing it to make yourself feel better. You're doing it to be helpful to them. And I thought about this, and I just want to say this as it's really about suicidal clients and not self-harm. But I have heard patients say to me, my family, my friends would be so much better off if I died, if I wasn't here anymore. I've caused so much pain, they'd be better off. And my answer is always, in the most caring, plain speaking way I can, I say, I've been doing this for a while, and I've talked to a lot of spouses, family members, children of people who have committed suicide. Not once have I ever heard them say, man, I am so much better off since my parent died. I've never heard anyone say that. So remember, you might think people are better off, but no matter how bad you think it is, they still want you around. Just talk plainly to them. Don't be afraid. But give them a chance to know who you are and how trustworthy you are. That's why plain speaking is the most important. Developing that relationship is the most important thing. Hope that helps.
Okay, and we did have a hand up. I think the hand went down while you were speaking. There was a person who wanted to weigh in. Are you still there?
Yeah, that was me. We kind of got somewhere else in the conversation, but when Lindy was bringing up in our breakout room when we were talking about like generations, and just kind of being resistant to receiving help and stuff like that. I guess it wasn't just like younger kids. I know we're focusing on 18 and above, treatment age adults. But I've also experienced that, for people that have been in out of programs and the legal system and all that stuff throughout their life, it's kind of become like they've learned, what to say and what not to say, to avoid conflict or getting in trouble or anything like that. So I think that might be another concern too, not necessarily just for like younger kids and younger generation, but for a lot of people that are struggling in treatment and recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. People are always concerned about saying the right thing. They're mindful, not only am I going to get in trouble, but am I going to disturb you? So you have to be open, let them speak. Don't react to it emotionally, physically. Just listen and give them the opportunity. It's not necessarily going to happen the first session. It's going to take a while before they trust you. If they trust you after the first session, well, then obviously you're incredible. But give them some time to do. I also wanted to go back to the question about doing self-harm with instruments on their desk. Ask them. I'm noticing that you're looking for something to hurt yourself with now. Is this process making you anxious? Is this making you uncomfortable? If they're looking for that, they're uncomfortable. That's a great opportunity to ask, what is it about this that's making you uncomfortable? Yeah. The younger generation is the most prevalent with this behavior, the younger people. 14. Yeah.
So, Carol, there was one more thing that was in the chat earlier that I wanted to just throw out to you before it's about time to go to the next breakout. But we have a comment that said someone was pulling her hair out and she refused counseling, but her friends convinced her to shave her head. Is this harm reduction, even though she still has the issue?
Yep, I actually responded to that. Probably people haven't had a chance to see it. That's
Oh,
a
okay.
temporary solution. She's not going to be able to pull her hair if she doesn't have any hair. It's actually more than self-harm. It's actually a disorder called trichotillomania, which is one of my favorite disorders just because of the name. But there's more to it. It's a great temporary solution. She can't pull her hair out if she has no hair. But be careful, because she will probably look for another behavior while her hair is growing out. So it gives her some relief. And the important thing is to be able to say, so see, now that you don't have, what are you doing to cope differently? Use that as an immediate success for her. But just be prepared. She's probably going to use something else.
Great. Thank you. So with that, Danny, I guess we go back to you for the next breakout. You're muted, Danny.
Thank you very much. See, it happens to all of us. So we're going to bring you back to your breakouts. As mentioned, this one is going to be a little bit shorter, and same idea. We're going to share the questions that are going to be the base for the discussion. We'll see you in a bit.
So are we all back, Danny?
Yes, we're all back.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll do the same roundabout, Melissa. So if you want me to start. We had some of, I think, what are probably the more obvious ones, that there are still concerns about how available some of these are in terms of time frames. But mental health centers, Northern Human Services was mentioned, other community therapists that you may know of that aren't mental health centers. In some cases, the RCOs, the mental health peer support services also. And I think one of the questions, or one of actually the suggestions that I made, was to make sure that you reach out to those local resources and make sure that they feel comfortable accepting these kind of referrals, because we don't want to send people to a place where you make the referral and then it's not an appropriate referral. But in a more particular, some of the more non-traditional ideas that came up, one of our participants, who also is up north, mentioned that they have churches in their area that have had mental health training that may, again, be an appropriate option. And another person suggested that Smart Recovery could be an appropriate peer support group that people could go to because it does address behaviors in a more kind of cognitive behavioral way rather than just don't do that. So those were the suggestions that we had. And we did have a question, which I'll raise here again with you, Carol. Somebody suggested the mobile crisis team, but then we also had a little discussion about the fact that this is, if it's not a crisis, then it's not the appropriate. So again, making that distinction between whether this is actually a lethal or imminent danger, or whether this is self-harm that's an ongoing but non-lethal situation. So when we get to the discussion, Carol, you may want to respond to that as well.
Great.
So that's my group.
Great. Maggie, would you mind sharing from your group?
Absolutely. We had a variety of locations represented in our group, Upper Valley, Keene area, Manchester, Nashua, and discussed how services and resources are different depending on where you are. We also talked a lot about overlap between where we would send folks. So, someone who is a mom in recovery for example, are and is presenting self-harm, are we going to refer them to a mental health center, or are we going to refer them to a program like Cynthia Day? And what would be most beneficial in that situation? And what, is we're referring her to Cynthia Day, do they have the type of supports, mental health supports that she would be needing for the self-harming as well as the recovery aspect?
Great, Maggie. Thank you so much. Okay, Lena, you're up.
Hi. So we had quite a bit of resources. We were fortunate to have someone in our group that works for Headrest. And if you've not Headrest, you can call or text them 24 hours, 7 days a week, and the number is 988. And they're there to support you and also provide more resources. One of the things that we talked about that I actually really liked is that they're talked about warm lines, where maybe someone, if they're not in crisis and they just needed someone to talk to when they're lonely, that they can be given the resource of a warm line. We spoke about NAMI is a great place for resources, and for the LGBTQI plus community, there's a thing called the Trevor Project, which could be a really great resource. Some more specific resources are like veterans lines and services. There's a lot of programs for veterans. We also talked about, like, when you work in a center, knowing who your recovery coaches are and asking permission to set people up with someone who maybe has had that shared experience, that lived experience. If you had that recovery coach in your center that is willing and open to talk about that, maybe setting that participant up with that specific coach could be really helpful. Lastly, we talked about how difficult resources are because they change so quickly, where we have, like, for example, doorways where it seems like their hours have diminished. Safe stations, a lot of them close their doors, and that's all usually due to funding issues, which I feel like that can be a whole separate community in practice. We also have the state of New Hampshire has a treatment locator, and SAMHSA as well. And then don't forget to call your fellow peer-to-peer recovery centers. It's one of the best things. Like, when I worked at SOS, I'd be calling Archways, especially if I had a participant who needed help in that area. And so like referring each other to our umbrella of centers.
Great. Thank you so much, Lena. Paul, and then we'll bring Carol back in and we will conclude.
Yeah, so we talked about lots of resources, healthcare for the homeless based in Manchester. We talked about the Strong as Granite campaign as a good resource. Also the Trevor Project and NAMI. There's a Survivors of Suicide Loss group. And then we talked about the On the Road to Wellness and the Step Up and Step Down voluntary residential program for mental health recovery. Someone also brought up Self-Mutilators Anonymous, which is really interesting. I hadn't heard about that, but it's a 12-step program, just like Alcoholics Anonymous. And then we talked about regional mental health centers, one peer to another in Laconia, and the Seacoast Mental Health Center.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Okay,
So,
Carol.
Let me read
sorry,
just
Lindy.
there's also a comment in the chat. One more that hasn't been mentioned is each region also has a public health network, and you can reach out to them to see what services in your area they might recommend. So, and now we'll pass it on to Carol.
Okay, thank you. Before I start on that, I just want to address one other thing that was brought up in the chat, and that was about sexual pain. And is that a self-harm issue? It can be, if they are engaging in pain, I suppose, to distract from other concerns, but it's more likely to be a preference. There are people who enjoy sexual pain, and so you can't assume that it's a self-injurious behavior. So just keep that in mind. It may be totally different. Sounds like I didn't give a very good answer, but that's all I can tell you. Okay, so some great resources, a lot of resources. I'll tell you a couple of others. If people are in the Manchester area, self-disclosure, I developed I was one of the people who developed this program, so, but I'm no longer there, is the MOM program. And these are these are moms who have substance use disorders, and they can also have behavioral health issues. So you can refer there. They don't necessarily get treatment there, but they will help them find a resource, refer them to it, and we'll check on them to make sure they're continuing to receive those services. They'll follow up with them. Their goal is to make sure that moms stay in treatment. The Vet Center in Hooksett is a mental health agency for veterans, for not only mental health issues, but substance use. They do great work. And then somebody mentioned the healthcare for the homeless in Manchester. There are healthcare for the homeless centers throughout New Hampshire. There's one on the seacoast. Again, the one in Nashua was one that I developed. It was at Harbor Care, and they will provide, they're an integrated facility, so they will provide primary care, mental health, substance use, and dental care for people. So if you're in the Nashua area, that's a great place to refer people. The most important thing to me, I'm not sure this will be helpful, but I'm going to say it anyways, is relationships. Don't be afraid to reach out. Now, I'll tell you, as a director of substance use services for Elliott Hospital, I hated when people called and said, I want to come to your emergency room and tell people about my program. Okay. An emergency room doesn't have time to hear about your program. They're dealing with life and death situations. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but that is the way it is. But that's different from you calling one of the social workers in the ED and saying, can I learn more about what you do? That's different from calling any of these places. Even if you've not heard their name today, find out about them. Call and ask if you can learn about their services. What's the distinction? If you call me and say, I want you to come and learn, I want to teach you about my services, that sounds self-serving. But if you want to know what services they offer, they're happy to tell you that, because it makes your job easier and better. It makes their job easier and better, and it's better care of the client. So my point is, it's relationships. The reason I was successful, and Lindy can tell you otherwise if she wants, is that I spent my life developing relationships. I know so many people in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. If there's a problem, I know who to call. Do that. Get known to them. Develop a relationship with them, so that if you need somebody, if your client needs someone, you automatically know who to call, or you know someone who can give you the right answer. And that means, if you said it, peer support centers, peer support recovery centers, EDs, have a social worker in the ED in the hospital that you know. Call the day in the day and find out. Talk to people. Clinicians, look at the clinical sites, the clinical practices, not just the mental health center, but all of the agencies. Call them and want to know more about their programs. They want services, but more importantly, they want you to know about the services. PCPs, if you have someone you're working with and you find out who their PCP is, you get a release of information, you're going to need a release for all of these. Call the PCP and say, I'm working. You probably won't talk to the doc. You'll talk to his nurse first. I'm working with this client who sees Dr. So-and-so, or if it's a nurse practitioner who sees so-and-so. I just want to work collaboratively with you and give you an update on them. Doctors, primary care providers love that, because they want to be best informed. They want to know that they have a partner in working on this client or with this client. So that's critically important. Mobile crisis, everything else that you said, the public health department, the healthcare for the homeless, talk to some of the housing programs, because maybe there's someone that they work with routinely, or they'll tell you, if you develop a relationship, yeah, don't go to this one. This is what happens. Go to this person. We've had a lot of success. You want to develop that network so that you have people at your fingertips. Even if you're not referring to them, they're the expert on who to call. Don't be afraid to do that. It's time well spent. It's time consuming, but it's time well spent.
Thank you, Carol. We've got just a couple minutes left and we need to go back to Danny, but I want to just call people's attention. There are some other ideas in the chat, so you can look at that while Danny's doing our closeout for us. And thank you so much, Carol, for your time and wisdom. Danny?
Thank you, Lindy, and thank you, Carol. Yes, as we only have a couple minutes to wrap up here, just a few reminders. Thank you, Carol, for all the insights and the information shared with us today. We'd like to thank all of you also for participating in the discussions in the breakout rooms and sharing your stories and insights. Please, there are all the resources that were mentioned and more you can find in our website, nhtac.org. You are going to find more resources and references to help you in these subjects. And also, we would like to take a few moments to fill out our evaluation. We highly value your feedback and want to prepare these sessions to be as useful as possible as it has been today. The link to the evaluation is here with a QR code. And as we mentioned at the beginning, a reminder for those seeking a CEU, you must leave your name in the evaluation form to receive the certificate. Thank you, Carol. Thank you for all the facilitators that led the breakout rooms and all of you that participated and made this as interactive and informative. Please have a great day. We'll see you next time.